Ready to go? Okay, so this morning we're going to talk about intimacy and the elderly. So we're going to cover quite a bit of ground this morning and go over quite a bit of information. So we're going to start off by talking about some myths in the elderly and them having intimacy. So some myths, come on in. Go ahead and sign in and grab some paperwork. We're just getting started. So what are some myths? What are some myths that you guys have heard about?
That they're too old.
They're too old. What's another one?
Cannot do it.
Can't do it. Can't physically do it, right?
Physically.
What else?
It's obscene.
It's obscene. It's dirty. It's not something that they should be doing. Grandma and grandpa shouldn't be having sex, right? That's not something. What about the old man in the nursing home?
Dirty old man.
Dirty old man. And an older lady, what might she be considered?
Loose, prostitute.
Loose, prostitute. Was that something that they did back in the day?
Probably
Most likely not. So intimacy is something that older people are also coming to terms with as well. So, some other myths are that they're fragile. They might physically not be able to do it, or they might get hurt if they try to be intimate. Sex is only for young people. It's not for older folks. Two older people are not capable of consenting. They're not able to say, I want to have an intimate relationship with somebody because, for whatever reason. And then, they can't have normal sexual relations. They can't do it like most normal people. So those are just some myths that we have. So what is intimacy? When you hear the word intimacy, what do you think of?
Engaged.
Engaged.
Being close.
Being close. Hugging, kissing. What else? When you're intimate with someone.
Being vulnerable.
Being vulnerable. Yep. Well, the actual definition of intimacy is an expression of the natural desire of human persons for connection, a state of reciprocated physical closeness to and emotional honesty with another. Physical closeness to another includes physical touch as demonstrated by non-genital, non-sexual touching, hugging, and caressing. Intimacy is not a synonym for sex. However, sexual activity frequently occurs within an intimate relationship. Historically speaking, intimacy is not something that we as Americans have been comfortable talking about. Our society has viewed sexuality itself as quite prohibitive, and we're quite prudish about it. Our culture in the United States also treats older people as kind of a surplus stock. They don't really have a lot of value to offer. There's still a lot of myths out there, things like masturbation will cause you to go blind and things like that. Especially the older generation, sex was not something that was discussed or even really mentioned.
Some of the Puritans.
The Puritans, thank you, Quakers, that whole mindset of, men sitting on one side of the church, the ladies on the other, just keeping the sexes separated. Amish still do that today, actually. And then there's some historical misconceptions and ignorance about sexually transmitted diseases because they didn't have those problems back in the day. So we're going to talk about some vocabulary real quick. There's protective oversight. That's an awareness 24 hours a day of the location of a resident. The ability to intervene on behalf of a resident, supervision of nutrition, medication, or actual provision of care, and the responsibility for the welfare of the resident. Somebody that's in our care is in protective oversight here at our facility. So then let's talk about sexual abuse. We've all had abuse and neglect training. So sexual abuse is subjecting another person to sexual contact by use of force, period. If you're doing something to somebody that they don't want, or if you see that being done to somebody, that's unwanted. It includes sexual harassment, sexual coercion, and assault. Sexual contact includes sexual intercourse, oral sex, masturbation, and sexual touch. Sexual activity includes sexual contact and other activities intended to cause sexual arousal. So that includes viewing sexually explicit material, reading suggestive material such as 50 Shades of Grey that we were talking about before we got started this morning, and phone sex as well. With the advent of the internet too, there's been much more technology introduced into sexual activity, so it's not quite what it was even 10 or 15 years ago. And then volition is a resident's clear, unequivocal, unforced, willing participation in an intimate relationship or sexual activity. Freedom from coercion is a trait of volition. And in this instance, a consenting resident means a resident whose participation in an intimate relationship or sexual activity is volitional.
Excuse me, can I come
Good
in?
morning, yes.
No, I have
Sorry.
a question.
That's okay. Yes.
Is this not also back to the sexual activity? And it's kind of off on the beaten path, but is that why, like, a calendar with a male on it or a female that's half naked considered sexual harassment just because it can cause, like, arousal and sexual?
I wouldn't necessarily consider it sexual harassment as much to the person having it as maybe to a roommate who might consider that inappropriate material. So let's say you and I are roommates and I've got, pictures of naked men on my wall and you don't like that, that could be considered sexual harassment by you because you're feeling that that's not okay.
Well,
That's
where I
your
worked
living
before,
space
there
too.
was a female who had a calendar with men in swimsuits,
Mhm.
like the female swimsuit.
Yeah.
And a male objected to that, and she had to take it down.
Interesting.
So
Usually
because
that
of-
would be the other way around.
Well, I was thinking because of the sexually suggestive material,
Yeah.
it would fit in there.
Sure,
Is
it
it
could be.
maybe a female or something might cause him to go off the deep end or something?
You never can tell. So, I think it just depends on the individual and what their perception of sexuality is too. So, since I don't have the big screen with us today, if you guys all look here, we've all seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, if you look down there, and I know it's a little small, but the most basic needs, the physiological needs, are breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, and excretion. So on the basic level of our needs is sex. So for us to not acknowledge that in our elderly and in their capabilities, I feel we're doing them a great disservice. So keep that in mind as we're going through this presentation, that is a basic need. I was also talking to the girls before we got started here this morning too about other cultures. And how here in America we don't necessarily look at that as a basic need or a physical need, but yet in other cultures such as Japan, they look at that as a man's basic need or a person's basic need. It's not something that is as non-discussed and non-addressed as it is here in the United States. So let's talk about sex. So if you guys have your sheet, go ahead and pull that out because we're going to look at that for a couple of seconds here. Aging baby boomers are going to soon become the largest generation of seniors in U.S. history. So with that, a lot of nursing homes and a lot of facilities are failing to recognize sexual rights. Here in Michigan, married couples have the right to private visits. Did you guys know that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Good. So, and as you can see here, the desire for intimacy doesn't go away. You can look here and see the level of men and women who are still participating actively and having an active sex life, even in their later years. I mean, one of this, 76 to 85 years, 16.7% had sex with a partner at least once in the previous 12 months. How many people here feel that that's kind of shocking, that you didn't maybe think that? Anybody?
I don't think we think about it so much as in the nursing home, but I can see that being more feasible in private homes.
Sure. Sure. So, elderly population continues to grow. So we're going to see this more and more and more. What other key characteristic are we seeing about baby boomers that we may not have seen with the previous generation?
Increase in STDs.
That too, but what else? What happened in 1969?
The hippie love flower child
Exactly.
grew up into existence.
Yep. So we had the hippies, the flower children, the free love, where sex wasn't so much of a bad thing anymore. It was a good thing. It made you feel good. So the baby boomers have that, come from that mindset of the 60s and the flower children. So
What's flower children?
It was just a
Carefree.
expression,
You lived in communes,
coined
didn't have to wear
generation.
clothes, could sleep with anyone and it was okay.
What?
Sure, San Francisco.
Anything goes was kind of like the thing.
Yep.
It was free love, free expression.
Had to have been terrible for parents. So.
You remember the 60s song, if you're going to, San Francisco, wear flowers in your hair? Have you ever heard that one? No? That's
Go
kind
ahead,
of where
sing
the-
it, Amy. Okay.
No, thank you. Not this early in the morning. I'll play you the tape one of these days. So with that, intimacy doesn't go away. So when we're 90 years old, guess what? We're still going to have those physical desires. So maybe not every single day like we do today, but we will have those physical desires. The elderly population is going to grow. There's going to be a much bigger need for care and a much bigger need for homes and places for the aged. By 2020, it's expected to grow by 16.8%, and we're expected to have an elderly population of 56 million people. By 2050, by another 20.9%, and the expected population of elderly will be 83.7 million. By then, I'll be falling into that category myself. So, something to think about. The AARP did a male study. They had 1,300 plus responses of both men and women. A majority of the responders said that sex is important to them, that it still is a part of who they are. 9 out of 10, though, emphasize that the relationship quality above sex is just as important. So even though they have said that intimacy is important to them, that relationship that they have is also important as well. Majority of those over 75 still find their spouse physically attractive. That says a lot, doesn't it? That's pretty awesome. So, we've already mentioned that aging baby boomers are going to soon become the largest generation of seniors in the United States history. Many nursing homes and many facilities, hospitals, whatever, they're failing to recognize sexual rights. Elders have the same rights that we do. They also still have the right to get married and make decisions for themselves and things like that. So, with that, though, we're going to be looking at some generational changes that we're not necessarily seeing just yet, but that we are going to. There's a higher level of divorce rate among baby boomers. We've all heard it said that at least 50% of marriages end in divorce today. They have more liberal ideas about sexuality than previous generations. Cohabiting without marriage is absolutely okay by them. Some still view it as, not a cool thing, but with a lot of them, that's an okay thing. They're more aware of their rights than other generations. They know what they can and can't do. They know what they can and can't get away with. They're read up on, they're intelligent, they know what's going on, and they're not going to let somebody maybe pull the wool over their eyes, much like other generations may have. Many report higher levels of personal satisfaction at that point in their lives, especially right now. A lot of them have reached retirement age, they're doing what they want to do, they're, spending their children's inheritance, so they're enjoying the good life, and they really like life. They're not ready to just kick the bucket just yet. So, internet usage is rising. My 70-some-odd-year-old grandmother had Facebook pages. So, I never thought I would see the day, but, with the advent usage of the internet, we have also seen a rise in pornography use and things like that. It's more liberally accessed these days, and it's something you can do in private. So, you have your computer in front of you, and you can watch and view things that you might not have been able to even do 10 years ago. So they are able to have more frank discussions about sex in general. They're more open to the discussion and the idea of intimacy and sex. Some may have alternative lifestyles. Primarily here, we're talking about male and female intimate relationships, but homosexuality is becoming a little bit more common these days and more accepted, and some elders may be interested in pursuing alternative lifestyles. The former ways of meeting people no longer applies. They're not really having church bingo. A lot of people don't even attend church services anymore, the VFW, things like that. People don't do the same activities that they used to do. Online dating for seniors has exploded in the last 10 years. They have sites like eHarmony, Match.com, Our Time. I don't know if you guys have seen the commercials for those, but that's becoming a way for people to meet that they didn't have, 30 years ago. So it's really been interesting to see. So then we also have the problem with sexually transmitted diseases. when people today, well, when older people today were having sex years ago in their teen years, they used condoms to prevent pregnancy. They didn't have to worry so much about AIDS and HIV and things like that. So many are not educated on the needs to use condoms to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. An increase in sexually transmitted diseases among the elderly has risen quite a bit in the last 15 years. Most of them don't know that much about AIDS. A lot of them still feel that AIDS is a gay disease, that they're not going to get it, that it doesn't affect them, and there's quite a bit of ignorance about that in older people. So that's something to be aware of. So the rate of sexually transmitted diseases has more than doubled in middle-aged adults and the elderly over the last decade. According to the Centers for Disease Control, close to 2,550 cases of syphilis were reported among adults between the ages of 45 and 65 in 2010, and that's up from about 900 cases in the year 2000. So you can see how widespread that's becoming. And then the number of reported chlamydia cases in the age group almost tripled, from around 6,700 in the year 2000 to 19,600 a decade later. So continuing on that line, we had talked about the AARP survey earlier, and close to 3 out of 10 respondents said they had sex once a week. Half of those were single, but some were dating or engaged, and 36 of those were married. 85% of men and 61% of women said sex was important to their quality of life. And just 12% of single men who are dating and 32% of single women who are dating reported always using condoms during sex. So that's pretty low. There's also been an increase in the use of erectile dysfunction drugs. These were introduced in 1998. We all remember the original Viagra commercials, the little blue pill. So men who took the AARP study also admitted to taking Cialis, Levitra, or Viagra. And those who took those drugs had about twice the risk for being diagnosed with an STD as men who didn't take the drug. So those who are using the ED drugs, they're going to double their risk of contracting a sexually transmitted disease.
Does that mean they were twice as active, or?
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? The survey didn't exactly go into that much detail, and I didn't want to press on it. So one thing that physicians are just now starting to do is to discuss STD risk when prescribing these medications. For years, they weren't thinking about that, and now that these sexually transmitted diseases have increased, physicians are strongly being encouraged, please discuss the use of safe sex with your patients when you're prescribing these drugs, because even though they may need these drugs, they may still need to use a condom as well. So what are some ethical implications here? Technically, we're in the elders' home here. Many of our residents have roommates. They need to be taken into consideration. We need to respect the resident as a person, and we need to follow the ethical principle of first do no harm. We have an ethical and legal obligation to allow residents to have privacy, and we have an ethical right to allow confidentiality. HIPAA is only about their medical conditions. We have a right to keep their medical information private, but when it comes to their sex life and their right to be intimate, we also have the right to keep that private as well. This is their home. If you go to visit someone's home and you accidentally walked in on them, obviously it's going to be embarrassing for you, but it also is something that you're not going to go and just blab to everybody either, that, oh my gosh, I walked into, Joe and Bob's house and they were going at it. So we kind of need to be respectful of our elders in that aspect too. Let's talk about dementia a little bit. I know there's been some instances here where persons with dementia have been separated, so let's talk about that a little bit. Simply having a diagnosis of dementia does not mean that someone does not have the mental capacity to make their own decisions and understand the implication of those decisions. So let's say somebody has dementia. That does not mean that they can't make the decision to be intimate with another person. The ability of the person to understand the implications may vary from person to person depending on the type of dementia and how it's affecting their brain. It's important to consider whether the person with dementia has the ability to recognize who the other person is and most importantly, whether they have the ability to say no or to express their wishes in other ways. Does everybody remember when Sandra Day O'Connor retired from the Supreme Court?
I do.
Yep. One of the reasons that she retired was to take care of her elderly husband who had Alzheimer's disease. One of the stories that came out shortly after she had retired was the fact that her husband had found an intimate relationship with another lady in the nursing home that he was living at. She was okay with this because it brought him a measure of peace and happiness. And instead of her getting jealous and angry and upset, as us ladies like to do from time to time, she chose to look at that as a positive thing in her husband's life, that he could still form a relationship with somebody and still have, a level of feeling with somebody else. So, if anybody's interested in this story, I can look it up and find it for you. But it was really kind of empowering to read that she would allow that and that she encouraged that. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. So what are some gray areas when it comes to dementia? A resident has an early stages of dementia. Maybe they just forget where they put their keys. Maybe, they don't always remember to brush their teeth, or they sometimes forget names. Early stages. Then we have to deal with family members' feelings on the subject. That can get really awkward and really uncomfortable fast, especially if they have power of attorney or their guardian or whatever. What if somebody has a diagnosis of hypersexuality? That is a diagnosis, and it can be especially true in the elderly. When I first started as a SENA years and years ago, we had a gentleman who would masturbate all day long, and it made other people uncomfortable. But that brought him a measure of comfort and peace, and we provided privacy for him and allowed him to do that. So we have to take those types of things into consideration. Health problems. Are they physically able to have sex? Is this something that could cause them to have a heart attack? Is it really an acceptable thing for them to be doing? And then we have to look at the ability to give consent sexually. Are they able to understand what's going on? Are they able to recognize that this person may not be their spouse or things like that? Then we have the problem of sexual abuse, because we don't want anybody to ever feel uncomfortable in their own home. Suspected sexual abuse has to be reported, period. That's the law. We can't get around that. While sexual abuse might seem to involve violence or force, it can also take the form of making a person watch or participate in activities such as watching pornography. Kathy, you'd mentioned earlier about, a calendar. In theory, could that fall under the sexual abuse? Maybe. So, what are some signs? There may be bruising in the genital area, frequent yeast infections in women, bruising near the anus. They may have bruises in their thighs where their legs may have been forced apart, where the fingerprint bruises would appear and things like that. Some may also have bruising around their mouth if they were forced to give oral intercourse, things like that. And then some with dementia may not even be aware of what's going on. That's still reportable. Even if they seem to be okay with it, if it looks like it's being forced upon somebody, that's never, ever, ever okay.
Wouldn't that be also if the perpetrator was with dementia? It's still reportable.
Still reportable. Yep. And in a case like that, the best things that we could do would be to separate them, contact families. Obviously, we're going to report that to the state. With them having dementia, it's really hard to say what the state would do at that point and, what we would do. So I think it would just go on a case-by-case basis. So we have to take into consideration resident rights. How can our facility feel like home if we fail to meet the rights of the residents? Residents have the right to privacy and confidentiality, and they also have the right to self-determination. And married couples have the right to be alone. When I was a SENA again, years and years ago, there was a gentleman who would, this particular facility had private rooms. He would go and shut the door and lock it when he was visiting his wife. That made all of us a little uncomfortable. What's he doing in there? Well, guess what? He had the right. They had the right to do that. I believe she had MS or, something like that. But it always made us wonder, but you know what? That was their right to do that. And so, in spite of what we may have thought, it was what it was, and we had to deal with it. So, But again, that just goes to show it made us uncomfortable. Are they having sex in there? Oh my gosh. You know, that's just the mindset that a lot of people still have. So we also need to determine willingness. Is somebody able to consent? Are they able to give volition? Is the person capable of making a conscious decision regarding an intimate relationship? Is the resident even aware of the relationship? Maybe one day they think, you know, this is their husband and they're patting him on the hand and holding hands. The next, 5 hours later, they don't know who the heck this guy is. They don't want him anywhere near them. What is the resident's ability to avoid exploitation? Is the resident aware of any potential risk? Then we also need to explore our own feelings. How do we feel about sex? How do we feel about the elderly being intimate? How do you feel about this being in your work environment? This is going to become more and more common, and these discussions are going to come up more and more as the baby boomers age. Do the words gross or disgusting come up, or ew? Do you think that way? Does this make you uncomfortable? Should we be involved in helping elders appropriately express their sexuality? Do we provide condoms and lubricant to them? Where do we draw the line? What can you do? And is it okay for an unmarried couple to do this? Those are just some thoughts. We don't have to discuss these today, but these are just some thoughts that will come up. So, anybody want to talk about how they feel about it?
Well, I'm just concerned about, I'd like to think that in this facility, it's not a big issue. I know there's maybe certain situations that are kind of isolated, but is there, who decides? Is there a committee that should be formed that decides whether this person has been exploited? Those are really hard determinations to come up with, and I think it'd be just easier to avoid it or look the other way. But is that our responsibility also? And so it is really, being a guy, I have to admit, I have to be maybe a little bit more concerned about what you're talking about because of the possibility of being implicated in such activity.
Sure.
It has to be one of those things that I'm thinking about maybe all the time, perhaps.
Sure.
Making sure that I'm protected, the people around me are protected. It's, some fleeting thoughts
you're right on all levels, and this is why I kind of wanted to talk about this subject, because I think it's something that isn't addressed much, and you're right. Any of us could be implicated if we're giving condoms and lubricant to help while we're promoting that relationship, and Mrs. Jones is able to speak for herself, Mr. Smith isn't, so the kids get upset. Here we've allowed this to happen, and are we going to be held responsible?
Right.
So it's a lot to consider, and it's a lot to take in. And then of course there's our own ideas about just general sexuality and intimacy as it is. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have a committee or anything like this.
But we have the ethics committee who can.
We
Which
do.
might be
Yeah.
part
But
of
also, I think
something.
another part of this is that we're a Christian facility.
Yes. Yes.
And I think we have, more of a defined level of where we're gonna go with this than most facilities, because of our religious background, we should be a little bit more what some people would consider stricter.
Yes. And
You
you
hate to
guys.
have anything in the news that
Oh.
Yeah.
that not only accounted for an event, but also the support of something to it.
Involve the whole community,
Yes.
the corporate, the Catholic
be
Community, oh my.
Yep, it'll go all the way to the Pope before it's all
Oh,
said and
yeah.
done.
Oh.
But no, that's a great point too, and I think in a Christian facility like we are, I think there would be stricter standards, if you will. Unmarried couples being intimate together is probably going to be frowned upon, things like that. So really, I don't think we have a whole lot to worry about just yet. I really think this is going to be coming in the next 10 to 20 years. But definitely some good points. So I listed a couple of the laws from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, and then of course the national law regarding married couples. In a residential community, the resident has the right to share a room with his or her spouse when married residents live in the same facility and both spouses consent to the arrangement. The Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, self-determination and participation. The resident has the right to choose activities, schedule, and healthcare consistent with his or her interests, assessments, and plans of care. Interact with members of the community, both inside and outside the facility, and make choices about aspects of his or her life in the facility that are significant to the resident. So, again, those are open to interpretation, aren't they? Doesn't that kind of leave it open to determine what the resident does and doesn't want? A little bit. So what are some do's and some don'ts? Don't assume that the resident doesn't need education on the topic. Many are sexually ignorant due to their own upbringing, choice, religious background, etc. Don't assume that it's not happening. Just because you're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not going on. Do remember that different ethnic and religious groups have different beliefs and practices, and do help the elder to maintain good hygiene to prevent infections. So we have a couple scenarios. Let's go through these. Scenario 1. You walk into a room and Mr. and Mrs. Jones are both naked and in bed together. Mrs. Jones is a resident here and is cognitively aware and is her own responsibility. What do you do and how do you react?
Number one, you shouldn't have walked in, you should have knocked.
Thank
Anyway,
you. Good answer. Gold
I would
star.
give them maybe a sign, a do not disturb sign for their door. When they want to put it on, it's available, and people know stay away from that room when that's on the door.
Okay, but in the immediacy, you've just walked in on them.
Let's see.
What do you do?
I'm sorry,
I'm
back
sorry.
out, close the door.
Excellent. Okay, scenario 2. Mr. Jones is masturbating in his room while watching a pornographic movie. He has a roommate who is complaining about this. What do you do?
Either give him a private room or give him privacy.
Touch
So
this
Mr.
door.
Roommate doesn't know what he's doing in the first place.
Right. So, let's say he's watching this on his computer. What's something that you could do to help both parties?
Well, you could try to give the person more privacy. The curtain, you got maybe the volume turning down. I mean, if you weren't.
What'd you say? Earplugs.
Try to eliminate the exposure, I guess.
Yep.
Turn up the other roommate's television.
Headphones too. They're dirt cheap. You can go to the dollar store and buy those for $1. Some other things, maybe moving the room around a little bit. Maybe swapping beds. Let's say the roommate doing this is in the bed by the door. You could put him over by the window. That way they have more privacy too. Because that's something that may come up from time to time and something that would be easy to address. So, scenario 3. Mr. Jones and Mrs. Smith are residents here. Mr. Jones is his own person and is a widower, while Mrs. Smith is also her own person but is still married. Mrs. Smith's daughter is very opposed to her mother having this relationship with Mr. Jones. What do you do? So we've got an instance here. Mrs. Smith is married, but she's her own decision maker. Mr. Jones is a widower.
Who says she wouldn't or hasn't done that outside of the facility?
Sure. And Mrs. Jones is her own person, so does her daughter have any say in this?
None whatsoever.
Not a word. So in that case, what would you do? How would you talk to Mrs. Smith's daughter?
I would let her know that that's between her mom and Mr. whatever, and if she had a problem, she would have to discuss that with her mother.
Excellent. Okay, scenario 4. Mrs. A and Mr. B are both residents. Both Mrs. A and Mr. B have diagnosis of dementia. Mrs. A is still married and her husband visits frequently. Mr. B is widowed and his children visit. Mr. B's children are very unhappy that a relationship is formed. What do you do? So they both have a diagnosis of dementia. It doesn't say if Mr. B's children are his guardians, but assuming that they are, how would we approach this? It's a little bit more complicated.
No, Kathy?
Why is it always me?
Come on, Kevin.
First, I would determine, like you said before, is it one day they're okay with each other and then 5 minutes later they don't know each other? But if they are even in their dementia, if they still have a continued intimacy and knowledge of each other, then there could really be a relationship there.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's like you said, the early stages of dementia where it can't really be determined, it would depend, I would say.
Yeah.
Then you would want to not encourage that relationship. But if they're in their dementia, really think that maybe they are their husband and wife, and this is the world that they're living in, then why would you want to destroy that world?
I think in a case
Good.
like this, it would be on a case-by-case basis. His children may be unhappy with it. If they are the guardians, we may end up having to move him. We may end up, putting him on another side of the building to keep the two of them separated. I think that could cause distress for both the residents, especially if it wasn't necessarily sexual, but maybe they were holding hands or, patting each other and kissing each other and things like that. And to have that removed suddenly could cause a bit of distress.
And some couples only need that much intimacy.
Some only need that much, and that's enough. Sometimes people just need somebody to hold their hand.
We have
So-
these people here. We have this, but the male resident is not here anymore.
No.
But it seems like it was like a big no-no. It seems like, you watch them, it's like,
Well, my understanding is that gentleman was quite the womanizer too, so
Yes,
can't have him
or-
kissing on all the ladies in the building. So the most important thing to remember is that this is going to be us someday. So something to consider. Not Kathy, of course.
Shoot me first.
Yeah.
So does anybody have any questions or discussions or anything like that?
That's a big question mark. It's still
Let me, I've been kind of stuck in a situation, and I'm willing to maybe expose myself a little bit.
Hold on
Wait
just a second.
minute. This is being videotaped.